Paying your taxes is Sharia. They throw out this word, yet no one can define it because they haven't done their research. So they vilify it to throw everybody else off, and then people will come to me and start attacking me about, you want to impose Sharia law in the United States. And in my mind, I'm like, sorry, here. Like, it's in the it's in the amendments. It's part of who we are on a daily basis. And you're saying that because you don't know what it means. And Muslims aren't trying to change anything in the U.S. If you talk to majority of Muslims who've come here, you will know that they come from troubled past, whether they came from war-torn countries, or like Suhail's family came to get an education here, to make a better life for their families, and they love the United States. I don't even have to say that, but I'm saying it. And if you have neighbors who are Muslims, go talk to them. Have conversation, and you'll see how much you do have in common in the midst of the differences that you have, and you could still respect the differences without pointing fingers and without passing judgment or becoming violent. This country is going to tear itself apart if we could continue to go down this path, because it's going to get extremely dangerous. And it's even more dangerous when you see elected officials saying these types of things, that these people don't belong here and those people don't belong here. You know, 1/3 of the enslaved that came to the U.S. were Muslims, and they were forced into conversion into Christianity. We've been here from the beginning, just in a very different context. So having conversation, what you can do is actually teach your congregation about Islam, bringing someone, talking about just the basic fundamentals of Islam and what it means and how Islam coexists within the framework of the United States. Islam is one of what Islam actually promotes a lot, and people don't know, is religious freedom. Our job as Muslims, when we say we worship God, is not to convert people. That's not our job. Our job is to worship.
That's our job.
That's your job, yeah. We don't go knocking on people's doors. We don't. Our job is to worship God, and that is being kind to our neighbors, protecting our neighbors, and being there for one another. And religious freedom is a huge component of that. And Suhail and I do a lot of this work in different capacities in promoting religious freedom, not just for ourselves. And I always say that if your advocacy for religious freedom is just for people who pray like you and see God like you, then there's something wrong with your advocacy. You have to advocate for others. I actually trained Catholic nuns who live in Nigeria to advocate for themselves to the leaders in their community who happen to be Muslim. And one nun actually told me, she's like, you know, the people we have to go and have conversations with and talk about our rights are Muslim leaders. I was like, yes, you have to, and I'm going to train you to do that. And she found that hysterical. But I said, this is part of my faith. And people don't hear these stories because they don't open themselves up. So if faith leaders, community leaders were to have these types of conversations in their communities where people can come and ask questions, there's no wrong question. I think we can educate people way more than having them to rely on a channel that's giving misinformation and disinformation.
What you're saying is, the best way to do this is get to know each other. That's really not even, I mean, exchanging and understanding each other's holy books, that's good, but really just get to know each other. We know that Sharia, the Quran, the Bible, any of those things can get radicalized. And so if we're really going to get to know each other, we enter into a relationship. We have a women's group at our church that asked me a couple months ago, and I haven't followed up with you on this, but they were asking, and it was just honest questions that someone who did not grow up like you and doesn't believe as you do would ask.
Yeah.
Like, isn't the head covering oppressive? Like things like that. And I actually looked at this women's class, and I said, you know, we know some people. And I bet you she would come up here and we could have a little forum, ask a Muslim woman, and you can just ask her whatever you want. And they actually thought that was a fabulous idea.
Let's do it, and then we could sing Country Roads after.
Works for me. Works for me.
I'm down.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, in the spirit of that, though, just back to the civic discussion for just a moment. Suhail, you said something about 10 years ago that I've never forgotten, and you said it as someone who's very proud to be an American, but also someone who is Muslim. And I could tell, right, it's that core identity. As an evangelical Christian, I would say, you know, no one should ever ask me to choose between my faith and my patriotism. If I ever have to choose between Jesus and my country, I'm going to choose Jesus. That not because I hate my country, but because that's what following Jesus means, right? It means he comes first. But right following of him should result in a proper patriotism and a love for wherever you are and a desire for its good. And I heard that in you, in this statement. You said the U.S. Constitution is 100% Sharia compliant. Can you explain what, I know what you meant, but can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah. I think the way I came to that statement, I don't remember it, but it's something I would say. The way I came to that statement is, again, I'm also trained as a lawyer, and, Sharia is very complicated, but basically Sharia means it literally means the path. It's the way of the law, as Haranessa described, and it's not a rigid code. Right now, if you were to ask most people, including unfortunately a lot of Muslims, they'll think that Sharia is some type of code that you just pull off a shelf, blow off the dust, and begin implementing, no matter what kind of problem you might have. Right? Two neighbors are fighting over their fence line, and they're okay. Let's see what Sharia says about it. That's not the way it works. It's a set of legal principles that are very flexible given a certain area. But as Haranessa described, they have certain principles that are also, the basis for the law, including telling the truth, loving your neighbor, seeking justice, And so, just not to get too complicated, but I'll give you an example that goes back to the time of the early Muslims. There was somebody came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, to adjudicate a challenge, and the challenge was that somebody had asked a neighbor to tend to their flock, and the flock wandered off and left. And the person who had given the flock to the neighbor wanted restitution. And the question that the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked was, is it the custom in your particular geographic area to fence the flock at night or not fence the flock at night, to tie it at night, tie the animals at night, or to let them wander? And because that answer will determine whether the person was negligent or not. And, so that just is a very simple example of how there is flexibility built into Sharia law. It's the same thing with the U.S. Constitution in the sense that the Constitution, obviously our framers set forth certain principles, and they articulated those, and those have withstood now 250 years of a lot of controversy, and that we continue to have. I live just blocks away from the Supreme Court. But there are certain principles that we generally agree on, but obviously there are things that we don't agree on. You mentioned abortion. And we continue to have those cases and those fights, whether they're around the dinner table at Thanksgiving or in Congress or in the Supreme Court. But that's kind of where Sharia has that very similar, because the same principles that are laid out in the U.S. Constitution, as Haranessa articulated, are the same principles that are articulated in Sharia. So as she's saying, no Muslim comes to the United States rightfully trying to impose a Muslim kind of worldview on the U.S. or any other country. Now, there are some people who are going to do some crazy things, but I find those are in every religion, or no religion at all. Crazy people are crazy people. But what I tell people...
No extremist Christians.
Right, but what I tell people who are afraid of Sharia law, I'll be in Texas in 2 weeks with Governor Abbott, who's trying to ban Sharia law in Texas, is that, and we can talk about why that's being said and done, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. None of them good, but I've obviously tried to investigate why that's happening. But what I will say is that, just as you said, it's all about relationships in the end. It's easy. I had a friend 3 weeks ago from Alabama text me, and I've known her for 10 years, and she said, hey, I'm up for a job in the Trump administration. I know you know the folks there really well. Can you help me? Can you put in a good word? Because I think I'm really close. I said, absolutely, happy to do it. She's a big horse person, and I've known her. Sure enough, that afternoon, on her feed, social media, she had posted, there should never be a Muslim in government, right? And I was just like, what is the disconnect in this person's mind? She's not only a friend of mine for a long time, she's asking me to put my credibility on the line for her, which I was happy to do, maybe wrongfully, obviously, and yet politically she's saying, we don't need any Muslims in government, right? And to me, that kind of, yeah, I think it's an education. There's obviously a gap there in education. But I also, maybe it's been a problem that I haven't talked to her about being Muslim. She just sees me as a fellow knuckle-dragging right-winger that she likes and, and thinks can help her. But that, to me, it also says that level of misinformation, hate, whatever you want to call it, is paper thin. And I worked for Norman Mineta in the Bush administration, Japanese-American, who was locked up, as you mentioned, Pastor. He was locked up for 5 years in an internment camp, born and raised in California. Literally was in his Cub Scout uniform when the MPs came to take him away to Cody, Wyoming. And eventually, President Reagan apologized for that, and eventually we had offered, those families some type of restitution. But, as Winston Churchill said, whose mother was American, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all of their possibilities. And sometimes we have to kind of go through this movie, and whether it was Irish, either Italian or German or Italian, Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, obviously the legacy of slavery, we've often done the wrong thing. Eventually we get back to the Constitution to do the right thing, but unfortunately we often have to see this movie over and over again. That gives me faith, but doesn't take away from the fact that we have to deal with the challenges that are before us.
Can I add something to that? I also think it's imperative for Muslims to also be out there and having conversations with people and being open and being in spaces a lot of times that aren't comfortable. Because we tend to, when any group gets attacked, we tend to kind of go into our own silos and say, well, I'm here, I'm protected, I shouldn't go out there. And although, if there's an administration that you don't agree with, a lot of people don't go. So I will say that during Trump's first administration, a lot of Muslims did not interact with that administration. And I remember his last 2 years, he had the National Day of Prayers, like the first Thursday in May, and the Muslims that were invited didn't want to go. I went, and I went because representation matters. I was the only Muslim in that space, in the White House, that wasn't a Republican or that wasn't one of his friends. The other guy was his friend, and then the guy who did the Muslim prayer was part of the Pentagon. And so I went and was talking to people. They all thought I was some UAE princess. I was just like, like what? Like, oh, are you a princess from the Middle East? And I'm like, what? No. Oh, a princess from Virginia. But I'll tell you an incident that happened at that event. After the event was over, President Trump left, but Vice President Pence stayed. And so everybody was going and shaking hands. So I was like, I'm going to go and shake hands too. Why not? So I'm standing online, and I'm short. So people just kept cutting me, and I'm not. I was like, it's okay, Hudi, let everybody go. I was taming my New York City side. And so they were, and actually Vice President Pence saw that was happening. He just stopped everyone, moved his hand, grabbed my hand, pulled me to him, and then everybody just was kind of like, why did he do that? Who is she? No, I was just like, oh, they're going to think I'm the UAE princess again, right? And so he pulled me in, and he said, thank you so much for coming. And I was kind of in shock myself. And that takes insight, right? Maybe I didn't agree with him on politics. Maybe I didn't agree with him in the way things were running in this country. But for that moment, he saw me. He saw me when everybody else was just cutting me off, and I'm the only Muslim woman, the only one covered up. You could not miss me in that place. But he pulled me in, and he talked to me. I think he talked to me longer than anybody else. And he made eye contact, and I felt seen, right? And I appreciated that. And I told him that, and I said, thank you so much for doing that, because I don't think I would have been able to come and talk to you had it not been. And then we talked a little bit about religious freedom, and then I left. Those types of moments are important. But we as Muslims also have to do a job where we're in those spaces that are extremely uncomfortable and talking to people, because the minute we open our mouths, people will learn about who we are. If we stay silent, people are going to assume they know our story, they know who we are, that we are out to get people. You know, when I tell people that my youngest daughter is diabetic and she's insulin dependent and my insurance just dropped her insurance, and they're asking for $800 to get her insurance, to get her insulin, that's a problem, right? But that's a problem a lot of other people have also. So it's always important to put ourselves in that space as well.
You both do that really well, and that's one of the things I love about both of you. The other thing I've learned is when you do that, it gets you into trouble with your own people. I'm not exactly the most appreciated evangelical among some in my tribe, because I seek to do the right thing. I don't think, frankly, I do it as well as you two do, but to do that gets you in trouble. So if you guys could share a little bit of the cost of that. I know that you both have stories about that. Suhail, I remember you being on a panel at an event we both spoke at together, but you were on the panel in this particular issue. I was sitting out in the audience, and a rabbi actually looked at you. He was joking, obviously, but he looked at you and he said, hey, we don't hate you because you're Muslim, we hate you because you're a Republican. And then everybody roared and laughed about that. But it is true that in this environment, being a Muslim and a conservative puts you at odds sometimes, even with your own tribe. So if you could talk about that a little bit. And then Hernessa, I think you had a situation where Hernessa, by the way, is founding director. Is it still the only Muslim choir in the United States? Adams beat, and they were asked to sing the national anthem some time ago at one of the hockey games. So you guys go in either order you want to, just share a little bit about what you faced.
So that's that question is exactly why I wanted to come tonight to talk to y'all, because it really pains me how divided of a country we are. I've been in D.C. now for 32 years. I've been working in politics for over 40. And I think we're probably the most divided in my lifetime. I know there are other times, obviously the Civil War, 68 was a really violent year. But you're exactly right. In every facet of my life, whether it's music, or politics, or I work in the technology space now, people are labeled by their party affiliation. And right away people make assumptions about what you are. If you're a Republican, Democrat, within Republican, we have all kinds of stripes. In the Democratic Party, there's obviously a big conversation now about the DSA versus mainstream folks. And I just think it's really healthy to have those conversations, and that's one of the things that makes America special, is that we can have those conversations, but it's also something that really pains me that we are divided so deeply on some of these things that I think, when it comes down to it, especially if you have the good fortune to travel to other countries, you realize how special we are and how we should not be artificially divided based on some of our political differences or our religious differences or our ethnic differences or regional differences. I have a friend, one of my best friends, she's also from Alabama, a different girl, not the one who asked for the help, who had put together a list. We worked on Capitol Hill together, and she put together a list of things she was looking for in a guy that she wanted to marry. One of them, she said, and it was underlined, "No Yankees." I was just like, really, Kelly? And she was serious about it too. It wasn't just like a throwaway joke. So I think, to answer your question, and I don't want people to think that it's only in this conversation, evangelical Christians to open their hearts and their doors to Muslim Americans. I'd love that. But also Muslim Americans need to be open their doors. And I tell you, I spend a lot of time, to your question, Joel, I spend a lot of time talking to American Muslims and defending Christians, because they have a cartoonish view of evangelical Christians because of what they see on television or what they hear on the radio. And a lot of times it's based on real things, and I'm not dismissing it, but it takes two to tango, and all Americans, including Muslim Americans and evangelical Christians and people of other faith, need to reach out to get to know their neighbor, to know people in their community. And it's just what we started with. It's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. I don't one kind of baby quibble I'll have with her, and he says, I don't think you need to learn about a person's religion. It's nice, but I just think you need to learn about the person. And, if your neighbors happen to be Jewish on one side, evangelical Christian on the other, and the people across the street are Buddhist, or, just knowing them as humans and as people, as neighbors, as, residents of Shepherdstown or wherever you might live, I think that's the majority of the battle. But yeah, there are Muslim crowds that are very hostile towards me because they're like, he is a Republican and we don't get him. I have Democratic friends who are just like, he wants to deport my grandmother, and I have everything in between, Once they get to know me, that falls away. But if people kind of look at the label, that's what they start with, and so you kind of have to chip that away.
So I want to get back in just a minute to people getting to know you, but I want to turn that to your experience at a Baptist church that you told me about. But before we get there, I'd love for her to tell us her story about the national anthem and how that caused some uproar among your people.
Yeah. Remind me to tell you how I met Suhail later. So, I am a trained vocalist. I went to a performing arts high school in Queens, New York City, and I never thought I was ever going to ever use that, ever, until about 11 years ago when our executive imam, who's our lead, like a pastor, but in the mosque, he called me in and said, Hernasa, I hear you have a music background, and I was like, how do I answer this? Am I getting in trouble? It's like, that was 20 years ago, And he said, no, I want you to start the first ever mosque youth choir in the United States. And I laughed. I was like, what? We don't sing in our prayers. It's not part of our services. And he said, no, because these are Muslim-born American kids, and this is such a big culture here that we're doing a disservice that they're not having this in their life. So I said, okay, let me think about it. So it took me 6 months, and then I put together this choir. I had auditions, because I said, well, you need to know how to sing. And I did tell him, I said, I'm a trained vocalist, not a trained conductor, and he said, just do that, you'll be fine. Like that's so simple. And so we had auditions. I had about 22 kids start. And I honestly was thinking they're going to sing at one of our mosque events a year, and that's it. It's just going to be a rinky-dinky club, and we can go home. But what it ended up being was something so much more, and such a powerful program that God willed for it to happen. And now, over 10 years, we've had so many performances. And one of the performances that we were going to do was right after October 7th at the Wizards game in DC. And for a lot of people, when you sing the national anthem, it's no big deal because it's not like history being made, it's just a normal thing. But for the Muslim community, it is a big thing when the first Muslim American group sings the US national anthem at a Pro Bowl game. That's historic for us. And that's what was going to happen. And so we made it into a big deal, and I ended up having some people not in favor of it. And so they reached out to me, and they were saying things like, how can you sing the national of a country that's promoting genocide, and twisting the whole concept of why we were doing it. And so I had to have conversations with these people. All sorts of things were written about me on Facebook, and how I'm a sellout, and I'm this, and I'm that, and I'm trying to be famous. And I'm like, I'm not even the one singing, right? I can understand if I was the one singing, trying to be famous. These little kids, like 7 to 15 years old. And we talked about it, and the community was behind me, the mosque was behind me, the imam was behind me as to why we were doing it. And I explained to them, whether these kids sing the national anthem or not, what's going on in Gaza is not going to stop. It's not. We don't have that power. But if these kids do sing the national anthem, they will be proud of being Americans in this country. They will own that title, and they will ingrain it in them. And that's what we need to do. We need to stop saying to our kids that, oh, you're only from like your parents' country. Okay, ethnicity-wise, they might be. But these are born and raised American kids. And they need to be able to take that and be proud of it. And so that's the answers I was giving to people. Most people were fine. The two haters still kept going, but I was like, whatever, I'm done. Like, I'm not even going to entertain this anymore. And no one did either, and it kind of went away. And I took the kids, and they sang the national anthem, and they made history. And that's something that they're going to keep with them for the rest of their lives. And the beautiful part is, the majority of them were girls. And I say that because a lot of time people think that Muslim girls are oppressed. I wear this thing, I'm oppressed. Trust me, he knows, and he knows I'm not oppressed. I'm probably the most opinionated up here and the most vocal, and that's because that's something my faith encourages me to do, to stand up for justice. Even if it's against myself, even if I have to hold myself accountable, I have to say something. So that incident was such a huge thing in our community, but I think when people heard the reasoning for it, they understood the importance of it. And since then, we were invited this year to sing at the inauguration of Governor Spanberger as the first American Muslim group to sing at any inauguration in this country. And she selected the song, "This Land Is Your Land," and we sang that. And then she had invited us in the morning to sing at her prayer breakfast, and we sang "We Are the World." And so it's important. It's important for our kids to have these opportunities, and it's important for people to see these kids singing in a country that's having such a hard time right now about their identity, and yet they're representing. And I think that speaks volume when people in the audience see that. And they are surprised that Muslim kids know the national anthem, as they should. And they should be proud that they were born and raised in this country.
Yeah, you've done such a great job with that choir. And our mutual friend, Micah Hendler, and you and I doing some music together, just learning how music can connect people in ways that other things can't. And you guys have you sang at the Kennedy Center. And then you sang at Covenant Church, which was awesome to have you guys, after being in those distinguished venues, that you would come and be there for our people and sing Country Roads together. Like, that was really an awesome.
Yeah, and then you were so kind that you let me change one of the words in the song.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we did have to change a word. It wasn't anything about West Virginia, so don't get upset. Anyway, yeah.
Can I say how I talk about how so when I started getting into this work, I heard about Suhail, and people would tell me, like, yeah, there's this Muslim guy, and he's like, his parents are from India, but he's Republican, as if like that's the thing. And I'm like, okay, so what? Doesn't mean anything. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I'd like to meet him. And so I've met him at a few events, and Suhail normally is always to himself, and when he sees people, he does talk to them, but he's not a big yapper. And so I would see him sitting by himself or standing, and then people would come in and you would talk to them and whatnot. And then I would see you always showed up in Muslim events. You would always show up in any event where religious freedom was an issue or the topic, and you didn't back down, and I do appreciate that about you, that you were strong enough to not let people who vilified you, let that affect you, because that is really difficult when it comes in from your own community, that they're seeing you as an outsider and don't really understand where you're coming from. And then they forget that Islam in and of itself is diverse. We have scholars with difference of opinion on one topic, and they all can be right. So when I started to converse with Suhail, the first time, the longest conversation I had with him was during COVID. Suhail would organize a iftar, which is the breaking of the fast, at one of our community leaders' home. And so I would get invited to come as a guest, but that year they cut the invitation in half, so I wasn't invited, but the imam was. But his schedule was double booked, and so he couldn't go, so he called me up at 5 and said, Hudi, you have to go to this iftar. It's at 7 o'clock, it's 5 o'clock, you have an hour to get ready, an hour to go. And then he said, and you're just gonna have to speak on my behalf. And I'm like, excuse me, what? Now, the people in that audience were all Muslim ambassadors from all the Muslim countries, elected officials, people from Reagan's administration, and I'm not ready, this is like in 2 hours, what are you talking about? He's like, you'll be fine, just go. Yeah, but you had people from Reagan's administration at the event. And so I remember going in, and if you know Imam Majid, he's a big deal, nationally and internationally. So I'm speaking on his behalf. And I saw the disappointment in your face a little bit when you saw him, yeah, when I came in, because it was before I spoke, right? You were like, oh, he sent you, okay, you know. You're like, okay, you'll do fine. But then after I spoke, right, then I think I convinced him a little bit. But people really do ask me, like, how are you and Suhail friends? Because I do talk about politics, not as much as you do, and I don't know as much as you do. But I think it's because we're both open to respecting each other and our opinions, and even if it's diverse and not on the same page in certain issues, the ability to see somebody else as a human being is such a huge part of our faith that I think that I'm so grateful that both of us understand that. So thank you.
I wasn't disappointed, for the record. And actually, where we became friends is that I don't know about here in Shepherdstown, but in the Muslim American community, women definitely have to kind of fight to get center stage. And so I've always felt that she not only is capable of doing that, but can do it with grace. And so that's why I've always been a fan of hers and have invited you back to speak at that dinner. So, in my defense.
He did, multiple times. Every year he invites me, so I do appreciate that. I had to prove myself, but I did.
We are about 20 minutes away from our time's up moment, and so just a couple of other things. But I do want you to share that Baptist church story, if you don't mind, because I think it illustrates the way you go in with one identity, you almost leave with another one in terms of how they perceive you and the way that just changes. And it's a funny story, but it's also a cautionary tale, I think. Yeah. Right? About how we perceive people and to make sure that we see the whole person.
Yeah. So this was, I don't remember the exact year, but it was probably 2005 or 6. It was during the Bush years. I was working for the president, and I had become friends with Pastor Bob Roberts, who some of you all know in this room, who's a pastor of a mega church in Keller, Texas, just outside Fort Worth. Family was at the Alamo. I mean, this guy was Texas before there was the United States. Larger than life. You know, he's everything that you would think of a stereotype of somebody from Texas. And he, you know, a quick story. We were in Syria in 2009. This is after we became pretty close. This is before the Civil War, and we were at a rest stop on a bus ride going to a small village outside of Damascus, and we couldn't find Bob. And finally, we wandered into this little hut where this guy was selling ceramic plates, beautiful plates. And Bob was there. He's like 6 foot, 2 or 3, and he's like, the guy didn't speak this. The guy who owned the shop didn't speak any English, and Bob was just like, I want to buy all of these plates. Here's my credit card, and I need you to send it to Texas. That's Bob. And so Bob, I had met when he was on the board of the organization I mentioned, where I'm now a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement, which is a religious freedom think tank, an evangelical Christian religious freedom think tank that promotes religious freedom in the United States and around the globe. And Bob kind of came to me in the middle of, they were having a meeting, and he kind of stumbled across me, and he said, hey, what's your story? And I told him. He says, and you're a Muslim? I said, yeah. He's like, oh, well, if I invited you to my house, you wouldn't come, would you? I said, why wouldn't I? He said, well, because you're Muslim and I'm Christian. I said, yeah, sure, I'd come. He's like, because you wouldn't eat anything, would you? I said, yeah, I would. And he was asking, and I don't say this to make fun of Bob, but he was asking very basic, kind of elementary questions that, to me at the time, seemed kind of silly. But he was coming from an evangelical, and he later says that I was the first Muslim he met, right? And so he had a lot of these stereotypes that, if I invited a Muslim, they're not going to come. If they come, they're not going to eat anything. And so we became friends, and, over barbecue, Texas barbecue. And then he eventually said, I want you to come to my church. And I said, sure. I went to Christian school. The joke in our family, I'm the oldest of 5 kids, is that if you're a good Muslim, you go to Christian school. So I went to Christian school growing up, because my parents went to Christian school in India. So that, when they said, hey, we don't want you to go to this crazy public school where they have all kinds of bad things going on. We're going to send you to a Christian school because, first of all, they were confident that, I knew the difference between Islam and Christianity, but also they said they have a religious training there. They have a structure that, again, we feel very comfortable with as Muslims. So So Bob said, "Will you come to my church?" I said, "Absolutely." So I'm sitting in the front row of this church, mega church, and I went to Catholic school, I should point out. So an evangelical church was crazy. I mean, he had glow sticks and music, and I was like, "Dude, you're worshiping here? This is a concert, And so there, I'm sitting there, kind of minding on my own business, as it were. And Bob says, talking about loving your neighbor, and he says, "Hey, I want you to meet a friend of mine." And he pulls me up to the stage, and he hadn't prompted me or warned me about that. He starts talking to me. He's like, "What kind of music do you like?" I said, "Oh, Waylon and Johnny." And I had, I always wear boots and everything. And he said, "Well, you got your boots on." And at the time, I had a big old buckle on. He said, "What kind of buckle you got there?" And we were talking about a rodeo buckle from Colorado or something. And then we're talking about, he said, "Do you work for George W.?" And and the whole place, this is Texas, so they loved it. And then he says, "And you're a Muslim." And you could have heard, like in the movies, a record skip, And the whole place was like, it's like that Pace Picante commercial, get a rope, And he told me afterwards when we went to say, and then he started asking me about what it means to be a Muslim, things like that. He kind of interviewed me. Later he told me, and this is what Joel's trying to get to, he said, up until then, I said you were a Muslim, Suhail. They just thought you were a Mexican, But Bob loves telling that story. And since then, I've spoken at his church many times. And there were people, that came to him and said, "Look, Bob, we love you, but we don't come to church to hear from a Muslim," right? And they left the church. But there were a lot of people, particularly younger people, who said, "That was really interesting, and we want to learn more." Now, again, it wasn't a conversation about conversion or your religion is wrong and I'm right. It was just like, who are we? And what do we believe? And in my case, why are Muslims trained to love Christians and Jews? Because we call them people of the book. So we got into a little bit of doctrinal questions there, but we talked about that, and what's our relationship to Jesus, and we talked about that. And so it was kind of the beginning for Bob and his community to begin that dialogue. And I was the one who said, "Bob, you need to bring in the Jewish community too. It can't just be Muslim Christian, because you're leaving out an entire faith tradition." And now they have this regular programming with the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and others in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
I appreciate that story. We've been talking about perceived differences all night. Caricatures, stereotypes, things that we all ought to just dismiss about each other, right? If we're ever going to have authentic relationships with each other. But we are an evangelical and two Muslims up here, and there are some real differences. One group believes Jesus is God, the other doesn't. One believes he was crucified and rose from the dead, the other believes none of that happened. One group believes you have to believe all of that to be reconciled with God, and the other group believes if you believe any of that, you're not going to be reconciled with God. So in just being completely honest about those differences, can you share a little bit about, not just with me, you guys cross boundaries all the time in ways that blow me away, and I love it. What have you learned about building really authentic relationships across that kind of profound difference?
So the first is just relational, just getting to know people as people, first of all. And I truly believe, I think that's 80% of it. And then if there are doctrinal questions about religion, answering those in a very honest, forthright manner. And if you don't know the answer, don't make it up. It's because everybody makes that mistake. But yeah, that's kind of the formula, as it were. And for me, again, I have, now that I've been at a Christian think tank, I've tried to learn more about the Christian-Muslim relationship, not only currently in the United States, around the globe, hotspots. Ernest mentioned Nigeria, where Christians and Muslims are at each other's throats, unfortunately, and other places around the globe, to learn about why and how that's happening. It's usually not religiously based. Unfortunately, human beings have the capacity to hate each other no matter what, left-handed versus right-handed. The Houthis and the Tutsis killed each other over tribal differences. The average person walking by Rwanda at that time probably couldn't tell the difference. But unfortunately, we have that capacity to find differences and exploit them. People often exploit them for political purposes, coming back to what's happening now in the United States. So for me, it's just learning more about my religion, its relationship with Christianity, the history. There's a rich history of Muslim-Christian relations, going back to even before, what Ernest and I believe to be our last prophet, Muhammad, even before he was declared a prophet. It was a Christian who said this person will be somebody who will bring the word of God. And, the story goes from there. Doctrinally, I don't want to let Hernisa answer. Doctrinally, we're a little different in that, obviously, in order to be a Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, sent by God, and died on the cross for your sin, and that is fundamental. I often have to remind Muslims who try to kind of paper over those differences to say, oh, we love Jesus, and we consider him a great prophet, and he was born of a virgin birth to Mary, and he performed miracles, and he's coming back. Muhammad is dead, but Jesus is alive. That's all true of what Muslims believe. But we don't believe he was the Son of God who died on the cross, and that is kind of, in the end, fundamental. So what I tell my Christian friends and my Muslim friends and anybody else who wants to listen is, we have fundamentally irreconcilable differences when it comes to salvation. And we cannot paper over that. That is what makes us who we are. But we can agree, as Anissa referenced, that we should love our neighbor. We can agree that if we have an opioid addiction problem in our community, that we can work together to meet that challenge. If there is homelessness, if there is hunger, if there is somebody who needs health care, that we can agree on. And then we can let God judge us on the day of reckoning on who is right. And in the Muslim tradition, it's like, let the different people of different faiths compete in doing good works. So let's compete in that. Let's try to outdo each other in doing good things and serving our fellow humanity. And also in the Muslim community, it's not that Christians and Jews are not worthy of salvation. In the second verse of the chapter of the Quran, it says explicitly that whether they are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, if they follow God and enjoy righteousness, they will seek heaven. So we're not as exclusionary as you all are. I have to remind Muslims of that, not so much my Christian friends, because a lot of Muslims don't know that and will do all kinds of, make all kinds of horrible statements. But in the end, we have the same values, where we may disagree on salvation. We share the same values. And I have to remind my Christian friends, whether it's Matthew 5:9, and trying to, be the peacemakers, or for me, the one that always affected me in high school and to this day is John 4. When Jesus was engaging with the Samaritan woman at the well in front of his disciples, she was a triple whammy. She was a woman, she was a Samaritan, and she was not leading the most righteous life. And yet Jesus dealt with her with respect and compassion in front of his disciples in order to show that compassion in front of his disciples. But he also spoke to her in truth and said, look, you're not living the most righteous life. Pastor, correct me if I'm wrong. And so that to me is the model that I ask my fellow Christians to engage in when dealing with the other.
You just represented my faith incredibly well, the way you articulated it. Bro, if we could just get you across that line, that's all I'm saying. But yeah. I mean, you can tell. We've had these discussions. You understand them, and that is key to these kinds of relationships. So thank you for that. Hurry.
I think when we see our own life experiences and we interact with other people and we see the goodness in the other person from the perspective of how God tells us to see them is profound. For me as a Muslim, everybody in this room is created by the same God that I pray to 5 times a day. And with that comes a responsibility that I have to each and every one of you. And that is to honor your dignity as a human being, is to honor and respect your choices you make in your life, whether I agree with them or not, is to advocate for you when you need advocacy, and to be just. And if we all did that, I think this world would be very, very different. And I also do think women should lead, but that's a whole other story. I don't know. I got in trouble for saying that. So, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll say it again. The essence of who we are as human beings, we're always, if you sit down and think, what makes you happy is always when you do something good, right? Right? That's part of the fitra. It's an Arabic word for like your natural disposition. Your fitra is always to do good. And when you do good, you feel good. And all those good things are always centered around other people and other living things and taking care of the earth and protecting animals and protecting our parents, protecting our children, protecting our neighbors. But we've become people who just live in our own world. We have no idea what's going on in our neighbor's home. We don't. Do we even know their names? Probably not. I don't know all my neighbors' names, and I should. I say that. And we get caught up in life. But imagine a world where we were so connected that I could look at you and know your name and know exactly your background and know exactly what you're going through. Some of us here are going through ailments. Some of us here are going through financial difficulties. Some of us are taking care of our parents. Imagine if we all knew each other's stories and we were able to help one another out. I think when we look at the humanity of how God ordained us to be, a lot of the problems that we have in the world would not even exist. And when we come to label people that you are this and you are that and I am this and I am that, brings more problems with it. So it's always being conscious of how I'm representing myself in this world rather than what is everybody else doing for me. We need to hold ourselves accountable, and I don't think we do that as much as we should. Especially, I see us, not being as attentive to our parents. And I say that because there's a ripple effect, right? That if we don't take care of our parents, it's going to come back to us. We're not teaching our children that they have to take care of their elders. And then taking care of the world. It's a process. It's not just about my father is sick, I need to go take him to the doctor. Your children see that, they're going to see someone else sick, they're going to help them out. So there's a ripple effect that ends up happening. If you do good, the ripple effect will be good. And if we do bad, the ripple effect will be bad. But if we just stop to see everyone's humanity and saying, the respect I want for myself, let me give it to this person, it will change the dynamics of communities across the U.S. And we will be that country that everyone looked up to. We will be that country that my father was like, we're going to go to the U.S. so that my children can have a safe life and my kids can go to school and get a college degree and I don't have to worry about their safety.
That is a really, really good word. I appreciate you guys. This, Stubblefield fielded a few questions for the two of you, maybe for me as well. You've answered all but one of them, actually. And I think the one that was left out had something to do with affordable housing, and that's all it said was affordable housing. And the best we could come up with was maybe the person asking the question wanted to know, is there a way we can solve that together? I think probably we should just conclude by saying, well, that'd be one of many issues. That a $500,000 house doesn't care which God you worship. And maybe that is something we can work on together. They'll come up here and conclude in just a minute. I want to give you one last shot, though. Is there something I forgot to ask? Is there something you have not gotten to say that you think needs to be said? And or is there something that is so important that it's the last thing these folks need to leave with tonight?
I would just say make it a daily routine, and before you go to sleep is ask yourself, did I help anybody today? I think that is so powerful in us seeing our own worth and the goodness that we have within ourselves, that we're extending it to other people.
Oh, that's great. For me, it's just kind of coming back to the issue of not kind of being so susceptible to being divided. I'm like a lot of Americans, I'm glued to my phone, and I often will start getting into these doom scroll type of things where I start commenting and fighting with people online. Less of that now, but it was bad during COVID when I was stuck at home. But I work for a tech company. I realize how much we're being manipulated, and it's not just by tech companies, but they're doing it too. But just in general, politicians, voices on television, on your screens and other places. Unfortunately, the incentives are to divide, and so it's just to kind of remind. This is for me, as much as it is for folks in the audience, just to remind yourself constantly not to kind of give in to those pressures, to kind of seek differences, but rather to kind of try not to look for the differences, but to look for the commonalities, particularly, in this context, we're coming on an election, and we can have very spirited conversations about the issues, nobody's saying you can't do that, but to not like the person, or not want to talk to them, or not have a meal with them, I keep hearing about people who dread going home for Thanksgiving or to Christmas because they don't want to deal with the uncle who's going to, raise this issue or has this particular. That just, to me, is a tragedy that we're letting ourselves be divided that much. So it's just a constant reminder, starting with myself, not to give in to those forces.
Well, thank you both. I had said this when we were planning this, and so just know the offer still stands. If you love this place and you want to stay a little bit longer, we will accommodate you for the evening. But I also know both of you have incredibly busy lives, and you need to get back to your place of residence and business. So I don't know how much longer you have, but as long as you do have with us, I know the folks would appreciate being able to come up and speak to you. But I love you both very, very much. Thank you for coming to my town. All right, and thanks to the Stubblefield Institute for hosting us.
And for bringing this conversation to Shepherdstown tonight. As we come to the close of our time together, I want to thank each of you for being willing to engage on what can be a very challenging topic for all of us. This evening began with a few simple questions about our assumptions, our relationships, and our willingness to engage across differences, and I hope that throughout this conversation we have been reminded that people are always more complex than the labels we assign them, and more interesting and nuanced than the assumptions we make about them. So while faith and politics often serve as markers of our identity, they do not have to become barriers to human connection. So as you leave tonight, I hope you don't simply remember a particular point or something that resonated with you, but rather leave with a renewed commitment to seek out conversations with those whose experiences, beliefs, or perspectives may differ from your own. I hope you leave more curious than you arrived tonight. And so thank you to my staff here at the Stubblefield Institute. Thank you to Covenant Church, to Haranisa and Suhail for being with us, and travel safely to your next destination. Have a good night.